A black officer was attacked by white men, but her response shocked everyone who witnessed the events. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and post in the comments where you're watching from. Naomi Jackson adjusted her police hat in the reflection of the patrol car's side mirror. The early morning sunlight cast a warm glow on the quiet streets of Millstone, a small town nestled in the heartland. It was a serene place on the surface, but Naomi knew better. Beneath the veneer of neighborly smiles and tidy storefronts, there lay undercurrents of tension, unspoken, yet palpable. For Naomi, a young black woman in uniform, every patrol was a delicate balancing act between maintaining order and defending her right to exist in that role. Her boots clicked against the pavement as she stepped out of the car, ready to start her rounds. The quiet hum of morning activity greeted her. Shopkeepers unlocking their doors, a jogger trotting by with earbuds in, and the faint aroma of coffee wafting from Mabel's diner. Naomi nodded at the jogger, who gave her a fleeting smile before looking away, as though the interaction required too much effort. She was used to that response. Millstone was her home, but it often didn't feel like it. Growing up, her father, a police officer himself, had instilled in her a sense of duty and justice. His death in the line of duty had only solidified her resolve to follow in his footsteps. Yet now, wearing the uniform he once wore, Naomi felt the weight of scrutiny every time she walked the streets. For some, she was a symbol of protection. For others, she was an unwelcome reminder of change. As she passed the corner of Main and Willow, she waved to Matt, the owner of the local coffee shop. He was already busy setting out chairs for the morning rush. "Morning, Officer Jackson," he called out, his cheerful tone a small but welcome respite. "Morning, Matt. Smells great, as always," she replied, her voice warm but professional. Matt chuckled. "Stop by if you need a pick-me-up. First cup's on me." Naomi smiled, but the gesture faded as she continued her patrol. Not everyone in Millstone was as welcoming as Matt. Her mind wandered to Mrs. Wilson, an elderly woman who often sat on her porch glaring as Naomi walked by. Sure enough, as Naomi turned onto Maple Street, there she was, perched in her rocking chair like a sentinel. Mrs. Wilson's sharp eyes tracked Naomi's every step. Naomi met her gaze briefly, offering a polite nod, but the older woman's expression remained stony. Naomi could almost hear the unspoken thoughts. What's a girl like her doing in a uniform like that? The weight of those stares was something Naomi had learned to carry, though it didn't make them any easier to bear. Each shift was a test of her resolve, a reminder that her presence in uniform challenged the unspoken norms of this town. Her radio crackled, pulling her from her thoughts. "Unit 12, we've got reports of a disturbance near the courthouse square. Possible verbal altercation." Naomi's grip on the radio tightened. "Copy that. Heading over now." The courthouse square was a hub of activity during the day, a place where vendors set up booths and families strolled through the park. As Naomi approached, she could see a small crowd gathered near the fountain. Voices rose above the usual chatter, sharp and accusatory. At the center of it all was a man she hadn't seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated a kind of hostility that made the air feel heavier. His voice carried over the crowd, laced with anger and venom. "You people think you can just take over, huh? Is that it?" the man bellowed. He wasn't addressing anyone in particular, but his gaze swept the crowd like a predator searching for prey. Naomi's stomach tightened. She recognized the situation for what it was, an instigator looking to provoke. The man's anger wasn't about anything specific. It was about everything he couldn't control. She approached calmly, her hand resting lightly on the radio clipped to her shoulder. The crowd parted as she moved through, some stepping back nervously, others pulling out their phones to record. The man's eyes locked on her and his expression twisted into something uglier. "Well, look at that. They send a little girl to handle me. Isn't that cute?" Naomi stopped a few feet away, her voice steady. "Sir, I'm Officer Jackson. Is there a problem here?" The man sneered. "The problem? The problem is you, Officer Jackson. You and all the others like you." The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Naomi felt their eyes on her, judging, waiting. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "I need you to lower your voice and step away from the crowd," she said. "We can talk about whatever's bothering you, but this isn't the place for it." The man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "What's bothering me? You wouldn't understand. People like you never do." Naomi clenched her jaw but kept her tone even. "Sir, I'm here to keep the peace. Please, step away and let's talk." He took a step closer, his bulk looming over her. The crowd grew quieter, the tension crackling like static electricity. Naomi's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. "You think that badge makes you somebody?" he said, his voice low but no less menacing. "You think it makes you better than me?" Naomi stared back at him, her face an unreadable mask. Inside, her thoughts churned. She had faced hostility before, but something about this man felt different, dangerous. She needed to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control. The man smirked, clearly enjoying the attention. "You don't belong here," he spat, "and one day this town's going to remember that." Naomi didn't flinch. She had heard worse. But the words hung in the air, a challenge not just to her authority, but to her very presence. She could feel the crowd's eyes on her, their silent questions. How will she respond? Will she lose control? Naomi's radio crackled again, breaking the moment. "Unit 12, do you need backup?" She pressed the button, her voice steady. "Negative. Situation under control." For now it was. But as she watched the man retreat into the crowd, his scowl promising trouble, Naomi knew this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. The courthouse square had settled into an uneasy quiet after the man left, but the tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Naomi returned to her patrol car, her mind replaying the encounter. She didn't know the man's name yet, but his face and words were etched into her memory. She had seen his type before. Someone angry at the world and looking for a target. But there was something more dangerous about him, something that felt personal. As the sun climbed higher, Naomi drove through the town's main streets, her eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. The chatter over the radio was routine. Reports of minor disputes, a stray dog wandering near the school, and the usual noise complaints. Nothing suggested that the man from earlier was causing more disturbances. Still, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a small crowd gathering near the park entrance. She slowed the car, her heart sinking as she recognized the figure at the center of the commotion. It was him. He was pacing back and forth, his voice loud and grating. His words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but the venom in his tone was palpable. "First, they take our jobs. Then, they take our neighborhoods. Now, they're taking our damn police force," he shouted, his arms gesturing wildly. Naomi pulled over and stepped out of the car, her presence immediately drawing the attention of the crowd. The man's eyes locked onto her and his expression twisted into a sneer. "Well, if it isn't Officer Jackson," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Come to silence me again?" Naomi approached calmly, keeping a few feet of distance between them. The crowd was watching intently, their phones already pointed at her. She felt the weight of their scrutiny, but focused on the man in front of her. "Sir, we've talked about this," she said, her tone measured. "You're disturbing the peace. I need you to calm down and move along." The man laughed, a harsh, joyless sound. "Disturbing the peace? You think I'm the problem here? The problem is you and your kind thinking you can take over this town." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she didn't let her composure slip. "I'm not here to argue with you, sir. I'm here to ensure everyone's safety, including yours. Now I'm asking you again. Please move along." He took a step closer, his bulk imposing. Naomi stood her ground, her hand resting lightly on her belt near her radio. She could feel the tension in the crowd. Some looked uneasy, others curious. A few seemed to enjoy the spectacle. "You think that badge makes you better than me?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think it gives you the right to tell me what to do?" Naomi didn't respond immediately. She held his gaze, her expression neutral but firm. Inside, her thoughts raced. She knew she had to de-escalate the situation, but she also knew that showing weakness could embolden him. "I think this badge represents the law," she said finally, "and the law applies to everyone." Her words only seemed to inflame him further. He stepped closer again, and she caught a whiff of alcohol on his breath. His voice rose, his words slurred but still sharp. "You don't belong here," he spat. "People like you don't belong in this town, and you sure as hell don't belong in that uniform." The words hit harder than Naomi expected, but she didn't let it show. She could feel the crowd's eyes on her, judging her every move. She knew that any misstep, any sign of anger or frustration would be used against her. "Sir, this is your final warning," she said, her voice steady but firm. "If you don't leave now, I'll have to take action." The man laughed again, his voice booming. "Take action? You think you can handle me? Go ahead, little girl. Show me what you've got." Naomi's pulse quickened, but she didn't move. The crowd was silent now, the air thick with tension. She could see the phones pointed at her, their screens capturing every moment. She knew she couldn't afford to lose control. Before she could respond, the man turned and kicked over a nearby trash can, sending its contents spilling onto the ground. He turned back to her, his expression daring her to react. Naomi took a step forward, her hand moving to her radio. "Unit 12, requesting backup at the park entrance. Possible 10-96. The man smirked, his hands spreading wide. "Oh, now you need backup? Can't handle me on your own." Naomi ignored him, focusing on the crowd. "Please step back," she said, her voice firm, "for your own safety." The crowd began to disperse slightly, their murmurs filling the air. Some stayed to watch, their phones still recording. Naomi could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but she didn't let it distract her. The man took another step toward her, his fists clenched. For a moment, she thought he might actually attack her. Her muscles tensed, ready to defend herself if necessary. But then he stopped, his expression shifting into something colder. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "You'll see." He turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched and his steps heavy. The tension in the air began to dissipate, but Naomi's heart was still racing. She stayed where she was, watching him until he disappeared from sight. As the crowd began to disperse, a few people approached her, offering words of support or thanks. But Naomi barely heard them. Her mind was focused on the man, on the way he had looked at her, on the promise in his words. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The unease from the encounter earlier in the day lingered as Naomi finished her patrol. She returned to the station to file her report, detailing the confrontation with the man who had finally introduced himself during the heated exchange as Roy Whitman. His name now had a face, one filled with anger and hostility that felt dangerously personal. Naomi had encountered prejudice before, but there was something about Roy that set him apart. His presence carried an air of volatility, a storm waiting to unleash its full fury. Back at her desk, Naomi typed up her report methodically, recounting the events with clinical precision. Yet, her thoughts kept drifting back to Roy's parting words. "This isn't over. You'll see." She shook her head, pushing away the creeping dread. She had faced threats before, and she would face them again. It was part of the job. By the time Naomi clocked out, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of Millstone. The transition from day to night brought a different rhythm to the town, one that Naomi had grown accustomed to over the years. She decided to take a longer route home, letting the evening air clear her head. The familiar sights and sounds of Millstone, children's laughter in the distance, the hum of cicadas, porch lights flickering on, provided a temporary comfort. As she turned onto a quieter street, Naomi's hand instinctively moved toward her holstered radio. The street was empty, but something felt off. She scanned her surroundings, her training kicking in. Years on, the force had taught her to trust her instincts, and tonight, those instincts screamed that she wasn't alone. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and close. Naomi turned quickly, her hand resting on her belt. Out of the shadows emerged Roy Whitman, his towering frame illuminated by the dim glow of a street lamp. He wasn't alone this time. 2 other men flanked him, their faces partially obscured by the brims of their caps. Roy's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of cold determination. "Officer Jackson," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Didn't expect to see you out here all alone." Naomi's pulse quickened, but her face remained calm, unreadable. "What do you want, Roy?" she asked, her tone steady. Roy took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You humiliated me today. Made me look weak in front of the whole town. I can't let that slide." Naomi's gaze flickered to the 2 men beside him. They weren't just muscle. They were backup, insurance for whatever Roy planned to do. She took a deep breath, her mind racing through her options. She could see their postures tense, their body language screaming aggression. "You made yourself look weak, Roy," Naomi said, her voice firm. "Now step back and let's end this before anyone gets hurt." Roy laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Oh, I don't think you're in a position to give orders, officer." Before she could respond, Roy lunged. His size and strength were overwhelming, and for a moment, Naomi felt the full force of his weight as he tried to take her to the ground. But she wasn't unprepared. Years of training surged to the forefront of her mind, and she moved instinctively, shifting her weight and driving her elbow into his ribs. He grunted in pain, but didn't let go. The other 2 men moved in, but Naomi was faster. She twisted out of Roy's grip and pivoted, her movements precise and controlled. She grabbed one of the men's arms, twisting it behind his back, and shoved him into the other, causing them both to stumble. Roy recovered quickly, his face contorted with rage. "You think you're better than me?" he roared, charging at her again. This time, Naomi was ready. She sidestepped his attack and used his momentum against him, locking his arm and bringing him to his knees. He struggled, but she held firm, her voice calm and authoritative. "Stay down, Roy," she said, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "It's over." But Roy didn't listen. With a sudden burst of strength, he pushed up, throwing her off balance. One of the other men swung at her, but Naomi ducked and countered with a sharp jab to his midsection, sending him sprawling. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of nearby residents. Porch lights flickered on, and faces appeared in windows. Someone shouted that they were calling the police. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Roy, realizing the tide had turned, made one last desperate attempt to overpower Naomi. But she was faster, stronger in her resolve. With a final maneuver, she swept his legs out from under him and pinned him to the ground, securing his hands behind his back with her cuffs. The other two men, seeing Roy subdued, hesitated before bolting into the darkness. Naomi didn't chase them. Her focus remained on Roy, who was now breathing heavily, his bravado replaced with the cold reality of defeat. The police cars arrived moments later, their flashing lights painting the scene in red and blue. Naomi's colleagues stepped out, their expressions a mix of shock and admiration. They took Roy into custody, and as they loaded him into the car, he glared at Naomi, his eyes filled with a simmering hatred. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice hoarse. "You'll see." Naomi didn't flinch. She watched as the car doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, taking Roy with it. Only then did she allow herself to breathe deeply, her muscles relaxing for the first time since the encounter began. As she stood under the street lamp, the adrenaline slowly fading, Naomi glanced around at the small group of residents who had come outside. Some looked at her with gratitude, others with quiet skepticism. But Naomi didn't linger on their reactions. She had done her job, and for now that was enough. Her radio crackled, pulling her back to the present. "Unit 12, situation resolved. Suspect in custody," she reported, her voice steady despite the chaos she had just endured. But deep down, Naomi knew this wasn't the end. Roy's words echoed in her mind, a lingering promise of more trouble to come. And as she walked back to her patrol car, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had only just begun. The air in the station felt heavier than usual as Naomi stepped through its double doors. The soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant buzz of phones filled the space, but for Naomi, the sounds were muffled under the weight of what had just transpired. She walked past her colleagues, their glances trailing after her. Some looked impressed, others skeptical, and a few avoided her gaze altogether. She headed straight for her desk to complete the arrest report on Roy Whitman. The adrenaline from the encounter still coursed through her veins, but her hands were steady as she typed, recounting every detail with clinical precision. Each keystroke felt like a catharsis, a way to impose order on the chaos of the night. Roy was already in holding. His loud, angry voice echoed faintly through the station, accompanied by the occasional clank of metal as he tested the bars of his cell. Naomi didn't need to see him to know he was seething. The image of his face, twisted with hatred and defiance as he was cuffed, was still fresh in her mind. "Hell of a night, huh?" Naomi looked up to see her partner, Officer Kevin Morales, leaning against the edge of her desk. Kevin was a few years her senior, with an easygoing demeanor that often masked his sharp instincts. He was one of the few people in the department Naomi trusted implicitly. "You could say that," she replied, her tone neutral. "I heard what happened. You okay?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly, laced with genuine concern. "I'm fine," she said, though the words felt rehearsed. "Roy Whitman's in custody. That's what matters." Kevin nodded but didn't move. He studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "You know, this guy's got a reputation, right? He's not just some loudmouth. He's been stirring up trouble since he moved here." "I figured as much," Naomi said, "but it doesn't change anything. He crossed the line, and now he's facing the consequences." Kevin hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful, Naomi. Guys like him, they don't just let things go." The words settled over her like a warning bell. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Thanks for the concern, Kevin. I'll handle it." Kevin straightened and nodded, sensing the conversation was over. "All right. Let me know if you need anything." As he walked away, Naomi returned to her report, the conversation lingering in her mind. Kevin's warning wasn't something she could easily dismiss, especially with Roy's parting words still echoing in her ears. "You'll regret this." The next morning, Naomi arrived at the station early, hoping to avoid the inevitable media storm that followed a viral video. The footage of her subduing Roy had spread across social media overnight, and the commentary was as divided as she had expected. Supporters praised her professionalism and composure, while critics accused her of excessive force or claimed she had provoked the situation. The video had transformed a routine arrest into a public spectacle, and Naomi was now at the center of it. Chief Daniels called her into his office not long after she arrived. The grizzled veteran had seen his share of controversies during his tenure, but Naomi could tell from his expression that this one was different. He gestured for her to sit, his fingers steepled on the desk in front of him. "Jackson, I've reviewed the report and the footage from last night," he began, his tone measured. "You handled the situation by the book. That's not in question." "Thank you, sir," Naomi said, though she could sense a but coming. "The problem," Daniels continued, "isn't what you did. It's how this is playing out in the court of public opinion. The town's divided. Some are calling you a hero. Others think you're a symbol of everything wrong with this department." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "With respect, sir, I didn't choose to make this public. I did my job." Daniels nodded. "I know, but perception matters, Jackson. Whitman's lawyer is already spinning this as a case of police misconduct. He's claiming you targeted him because of his race and that you escalated the situation unnecessarily." Naomi's stomach churned at the irony of the accusation. "That's ridiculous." "Maybe," Daniels said, "but it's their angle. And with that video out there, they've got a platform to push it." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "We're standing by you, Jackson, but you need to be prepared. This isn't just about the department. It's about you. They're going to come after your record, your reputation, everything." Naomi nodded, her mind already racing. She had faced challenges before, but this was uncharted territory. She wasn't just a police officer anymore. She was a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. As the days passed, the fallout from the arrest unfolded in predictable yet unsettling ways. News crews arrived in Millstone, setting up outside the station and in front of Roy's modest home. His supporters painted him as a victim, a hard-working man wronged by an overzealous officer. Naomi's detractors latched onto any scrap of information they could find, twisting it to fit their narrative. Her supporters, meanwhile, rallied around her, organizing community meetings and starting online campaigns in her defense. Roy, meanwhile, remained in custody, his defiance unshaken. He spent his days shouting at officers, demanding better treatment, and proclaiming his innocence. Naomi avoided him as much as possible, though their paths inevitably crossed in the small confines of the station. One afternoon, as she walked past the Holden cells, Roy called out to her. "Officer Jackson, got a minute?" She stopped but didn't approach, keeping a safe distance. "What do you want, Roy?" He leaned against the bars, his grin as menacing as ever. "Just wanted to thank you for making me famous. You've given me more attention in one night than I've had in my entire life." Naomi didn't respond, her expression neutral. "But don't get too comfortable," he continued. "This ain't over. You might have won the first round, but I don't go down that easy." Naomi held his gaze, her voice calm. "You're in a cell, Roy. I'd say the first round went pretty well." Roy's grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger, but he quickly masked it, stepping back from the bars. "We'll see, officer, we'll see." Naomi walked away, her mind heavy with the weight of his words. She knew he wasn't just bluffing. Roy Whitman was a man who thrived on conflict, and he wasn't going to let this go quietly. That night, as Naomi sat at her kitchen table reviewing her notes and preparing for the upcoming court proceedings, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Roy's arrest had sparked something bigger than either of them, and as much as she wanted to believe that justice would prevail, she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. Naomi looked out the window, the quiet streets of Millstone bathed in moonlight. She had chosen this life, knowing the challenges it entailed. And now, as the storm brewed around her, she resolved to face it head-on, no matter what it cost. The courtroom was packed. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of bodies as people leaned forward, eager to catch every word of the proceedings. The hum of whispers was a constant backdrop, punctuated by the occasional sharp rap of the judge's gavel. Naomi sat near the front, her uniform immaculate, her face an unreadable mask of professionalism. This wasn't her first time testifying, but it was her first time in a case that felt this personal. Roy Whitman sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. He looked calm, even smug, as though the outcome of the trial was already decided in his favor. The bruises from their encounter had faded, but his eyes still burned with the same venom Naomi had seen that night. His supporters sat behind him, their faces a mixture of defiance and disdain, while Naomi's colleagues and community allies filled the opposite side of the room. The trial had been building to this moment for weeks. Roy faced charges of assaulting a police officer, resisting arrest, and inciting public disorder. The prosecution had a solid case, bolstered by eyewitness testimony and the viral video that had captured the incident. But Roy's defense team was relentless, spinning the narrative to paint him as a victim of police overreach and racial bias. It was a masterful manipulation of facts, one that made Naomi's stomach churn every time she heard their arguments. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Emily Grant, rose to deliver her opening statement. Her voice was clear and commanding, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about accountability. The defendant, Roy Whitman, attacked Officer Naomi Jackson without provocation. He resisted lawful orders and endangered the safety of those around him. The evidence will show that Officer Jackson acted with restraint and professionalism despite being faced with an unprovoked act of aggression." Naomi's heart swelled with gratitude for Emily's unwavering confidence, but she knew the defense would strike back just as hard. And they did. When Roy's lawyer stood to deliver his opening statement, the tone shifted. He painted Roy as a misunderstood man, pushed to the brink by what he described as an overly aggressive police officer who had singled him out. "This is not just a case about Roy Whitman," the lawyer declared, his voice dripping with righteous indignation. "It's a case about systemic issues, about the misuse of power and the failure to treat all citizens equally. My client was provoked, humiliated, and forced to defend himself." Naomi felt the weight of those words settle over the courtroom like a cloud. She wanted to object, to stand up and refute every lie, but she knew her moment would come. When Naomi took the stand, the tension in the room was palpable. She sat tall, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as Emily guided her through her testimony. She recounted the events of that night with precision, her voice steady and measured. She described Roy's aggression, his refusal to comply, and the physical altercation that had led to his arrest. Every word was backed by evidence, every detail corroborated by witnesses and video footage. When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, the atmosphere grew sharper. Roy's lawyer approached with a predatory smile, his questions designed to unnerve her. "Officer Jackson," he began, "you've been a member of the Millstone Police Department for how long?" "5 years," Naomi replied. "And in that time, have you ever had complaints filed against you?" The question hung in the air, a deliberate attempt to sow doubt. Naomi met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I've had complaints, as most officers do," she said. "None were substantiated." The lawyer nodded, as though expecting her response. "And, on the night in question, would you say you were under stress?" "I was focused on my duty, not on stress," Naomi said evenly. The lawyer's smile widened. "Come now, officer. You were alone, facing a larger man. Isn't it possible that you overreacted out of fear?" Naomi's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "No, sir. I acted in accordance with my training and the law." The lawyer's questions grew more pointed, but Naomi held her ground, her answers precise and unwavering. By the time she stepped down from the stand, she felt both drained and defiant. She had spoken her truth, and now it was up to the jury to decide. The trial continued for days, each side presenting its case with meticulous detail. Witnesses were called, evidence was scrutinized, and the courtroom became a battleground of narratives. Outside, the town of Millstone buzzed with debate. The case had polarized the community, drawn lines between those who supported Naomi and those who sided with Roy. Naomi did her best to tune out the noise, focusing on her work and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But it wasn't easy. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the weight of the town's gaze. Strangers approached her with words of encouragement or hostility, their opinions shaped by headlines and social media posts. It was exhausting, but Naomi refused to let it break her. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was silent. The jury filed in, their expressions guarded as the judge called the proceedings to order. Naomi sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, as the foreman stood to deliver the decision. On the charge of assaulting a police officer, we find the defendant, Roy Whitman, guilty. A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by a murmur of voices. Naomi felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight wasn't over. Roy's supporters would continue to rally around him, and the scars of this case would linger in the town for years to come. Roy showed little reaction as the verdict was read, his face a mask of defiance. But when the judge handed down his sentence, 6 months in jail and mandatory anger management classes, his composure cracked. He stood abruptly, shouting over the judge's words. "This is a joke. You'll regret this, all of you." The bailiffs moved quickly to restrain him, and Naomi watched as he was led out of the courtroom, his voice still echoing with threats, She felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Roy meant every word. In the weeks that followed, life in Millstone slowly returned to normal. But for Naomi, the aftermath of the trial was a constant reminder of the challenges she faced. She received both praise and criticism, her actions dissected by people who had never walked in her shoes. She leaned on her friends and colleagues, finding strength in their support, but the burden of being a symbol weighed heavily on her. Roy's time in jail was just beginning, but Naomi knew his influence wouldn't end there. He had a following, a network of people who shared his views and were emboldened by his defiance. She kept her guard up, knowing that the storm might calm, but the undercurrents of resentment would persist. And yet, through it all, Naomi remained steadfast. She had chosen this path for a reason, and she wouldn't let fear or hate deter her. She was determined to stand firm, to protect her community, and to prove that justice, no matter how difficult, was always worth fighting for. The days after Roy Whitman's sentencing were quieter than Naomi had expected, but the silence was anything but comforting. The courtroom drama had subsided, the media had packed up their cameras, and the town of Millstone seemed eager to move on. Yet, for Naomi, the unease lingered. She knew that Roy's influence extended far beyond the walls of his jail cell, and his promise of retaliation still echoed in her mind. The department encouraged her to take a few days off, a rare gesture of support that Naomi reluctantly accepted. But even as she tried to relax at home, the tension didn't leave her. She spent her time flipping through news articles, reading comments online, and watching the footage of her altercation with Roy again and again. The video had been dissected and debated from every angle, yet Naomi couldn't help but scrutinize it for some overlooked detail, some hint of what might come next. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Naomi received an unexpected call from Kevin Morales. He had been her unofficial sounding board throughout the trial, and his calm, measured advice had kept her grounded. "You doing okay?" Kevin asked after a few moments of small talk. "As okay as I can be," Naomi replied. "Why?" Kevin hesitated, and Naomi could hear the faint murmur of voices in the background. "We just got word that Roy's requested a meeting. With you." Naomi sat up straighter, her heart skipping a beat. "What kind of meeting?" "Apparently, he's had a change of heart," Kevin said, his tone skeptical. "He claims he wants to apologize, to make things right." Naomi didn't respond immediately. The idea of sitting face to face with Roy, of hearing anything resembling an apology, seemed absurd, and yet a part of her was curious. What could possibly compel him to reach out now, after everything he'd done? "Do I have to go?" she asked finally. "No," Kevin said. "It's completely up to you, but if you're thinking about it, I'd suggest bringing backup, just in case." Naomi thanked him and hung up, her mind racing. She spent the rest of the evening debating whether to accept Roy's request. On one hand, she didn't trust him. On the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that this might be an opportunity to gain some insight into his motives, or at the very least to close this chapter on her own terms. 2 days later, Naomi found herself sitting across from Roy in a small, sterile meeting room at the county jail. A heavy metal table separated them, and a guard stood watch by the door, his presence a silent reminder of the boundaries Roy couldn't cross. Roy looked different. The arrogance that had defined him in the courtroom was gone, replaced by a subdued demeanor. He was thinner, his skin pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his once sharp eyes now carried a hint of weariness. For a moment, Naomi wondered if the man in front of her was even capable of the hatred and violence she'd experienced. But then, he spoke. "Officer Jackson," he began, his voice low. "Thank you for coming." Naomi folded her arms across her chest, keeping her expression neutral. "You said you had something to say." Roy nodded, his hands fidgeting on the table. "I wanted to apologize for what I did, for what I said." Naomi raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Why now?" Roy exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Because I've had a lot of time to think about everything, about the kind of man I've been." Naomi didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. "You were right," Roy said, his voice cracking slightly. "I was angry at the world, at myself, and I took it out on you. I thought if I could make you feel small, it'd make me feel bigger, but all it did was show me how small I really am." Naomi studied him carefully, searching for any sign of manipulation. His words sounded sincere, but sincerity was a skill Roy had likely honed over years of getting what he wanted. She decided to press further. "What made you change your mind?" she asked. Roy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "It was something my daughter said. I haven't seen her in years, not since her mother took her and left. But she wrote me a letter after the trial. She told me she saw the video, said she couldn't believe her father had turned into someone she didn't recognize." His voice faltered, and he took a moment to compose himself. "She told me if I wanted to be part of her life again, I had to make things right. And I knew she was right. I've spent so long blaming everyone else for my problems, I forgot to look in the mirror." Naomi felt a flicker of sympathy, though she quickly suppressed it. She wasn't ready to let her guard down. "So, this is about your daughter," she said, "not about the harm you caused me or anyone else." Roy looked up, his expression earnest. "It's about everything. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Officer Jackson. I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to know that I'm trying to be better." The room fell silent. Naomi considered his words, weighing their authenticity. Part of her wanted to believe him, to see this as a sign that even someone like Roy could change. But another part of her, the part hardened by years of dealing with people who lied and manipulated, refused to let her guard down. "I don't know if I believe you," she said finally, "but I hope you mean what you're saying. Not for me, but for your daughter." Roy nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I do." Naomi stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Good luck, Roy. You're going to need it." As she left the room, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, skepticism, and a faint glimmer of hope. She didn't know if Roy's apology was genuine or if it was just another attempt to regain control of the narrative. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, people could change. In the days that followed, Naomi returned to her routine with a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter with Roy had reminded her of why she'd chosen this path, not just to enforce the law, but to create opportunities for understanding and growth, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. Roy's words stayed with her, though she didn't dwell on them. She knew his journey was his own, and it wasn't her responsibility to ensure his redemption. Her job was to continue serving her community, to stand as a symbol of resilience and integrity in the face of adversity. And so she did. The chill of autumn settled over Millstone, its streets lined with gold and crimson leaves. The courthouse square, once the epicenter of heated debates and protests, now hummed with a quieter energy. Vendors set up their stalls for the seasonal harvest festival, and children ran through the park, their laughter a balm against the town's lingering tensions. Naomi Jackson leaned against her patrol car, sipping a cup of coffee from Matt's cafe. It was a rare moment of calm, and she allowed herself to savor it. Her encounter with Roy Whitman still weighed on her, but the meeting had brought a strange sense of closure. Whether or not his apology was genuine, she had faced him and come out stronger. Life in Millstone was slowly moving forward. The trial and its aftermath had left scars, but it had also sparked conversations the town could no longer ignore. Community meetings were held regularly, drawing residents from all walks of life to discuss issues of bias, accountability, and unity. Naomi attended these meetings whenever she could, though she often stayed in the background, listening rather than speaking. She knew her presence was enough, a reminder of what had been and what could be. One evening, Naomi was patrolling near the community center when she noticed a crowd gathered outside. Curious, she parked her car and approached. A banner hung above the entrance, reading, "Unity in Action, Building Bridges in Millstone." Inside, the room buzzed with activity. Tables were set up with pamphlets, posters, and displays highlighting local initiatives aimed at fostering understanding and collaboration. At the center of it all was Kevin Morales, addressing the crowd with his characteristic charisma. Naomi smiled to herself, admiring his ability to connect with people. Kevin caught her eye and waved her over. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming, "we have a special guest with us tonight. Officer Naomi Jackson, someone who embodies the resilience and courage we're here to celebrate." The crowd turned, and Naomi felt a wave of heat rise to her cheeks. She raised a hand in a modest wave, her heart pounding as applause filled the room. Kevin beckoned her to the front, and though she hesitated, she eventually joined him. "Naomi," Kevin said, his tone warm, "why don't you share a few words?" She glanced at the expectant faces in the crowd, her mind racing. Public speaking wasn't her strength, but she knew this moment was bigger than her discomfort. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm honored to be here tonight, surrounded by people who care so deeply about this community. Millstone has been through a lot recently, and I know it hasn't been easy for any of us." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "What we've experienced, what I've experienced, has shown me that change isn't just about laws or policies. It's about people. It's about listening to each other, challenging our assumptions, and choosing to do better every day." The room was silent, her words hanging in the air. Naomi took a deep breath and continued. "I won't pretend to have all the answers, but I believe in this town. I believe in our ability to grow, to heal, and to create a future where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued." The applause that followed was louder than before, and Naomi felt a surge of pride. She had spoken from the heart, and it had resonated. As she stepped down, several people approached her, offering words of encouragement and gratitude. Among them was an older woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Peterson, a longtime resident of Millstone. "Officer Jackson," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice trembling slightly, "I want to thank you for standing your ground, for showing us what strength looks like. You've inspired me to look at things differently, and I think you've inspired a lot of others too." Naomi felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. That means a lot." In the weeks that followed, Naomi noticed a shift in the town's atmosphere. The community meetings grew larger, attracting not just activists but also those who had previously stayed silent. Local businesses began supporting initiatives to promote diversity and inclusion, and schools incorporated lessons on empathy and understanding into their curricula. Naomi's role in this transformation didn't go unnoticed. She became a symbol of resilience and integrity, though she often deflected the attention, insisting that the real work was being done by the community as a whole. One day, as she was leaving the station, she received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but the return address caught her eye. It was from Roy Whitman. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was short, written in a shaky hand. Roy apologized again for his actions and thanked her for listening to him during their meeting. He mentioned that he was attending anger management classes and had started volunteering with a program that mentored at-risk youth. The final lines read, "I don't know if I'll ever make up for what I've done, but I'm trying. And for what it's worth, I'm grateful you didn't give up on me entirely." Naomi folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't know if Roy's transformation was permanent or if his words were entirely sincere, but the fact that he was making an effort gave her a small measure of hope. As winter approached, Naomi found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The challenges she had faced, the obstacles she had overcome, and the changes she had witnessed all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. She knew there was still work to be done, both in Millstone and within herself, but she also knew she wasn't alone. One crisp morning, she stood at the edge of the park, watching as children built snowmen and families gathered around steaming cups of cocoa. Kevin joined her, handing her a coffee. "Looks like the town's starting to turn a corner," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. Naomi nodded. "It's a start, but it's going to take all of us to keep moving forward." Kevin grinned. "You're right about that, and lucky for us, we've got you leading the way." Naomi smiled, her gaze fixed on the scene before her. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead might be uncertain, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. The first signs of spring crept into Millstone as the harsh winter began to fade. Buds appeared on the trees lining Main Street, and the once gray skies softened into a pale blue. The town, too, seemed to be coming to life again, not just in its streets, but in its spirit. The tension that had gripped Millstone for months was finally beginning to loosen. Naomi Jackson stepped out of her patrol car and adjusted her uniform. Today wasn't an ordinary day on duty. She had been invited to speak at a town hall event organized to celebrate the progress Millstone had made in recent months. It was a symbolic gathering, a moment for the town to reflect on its growth and acknowledge the work still to be done. As she made her way toward the community center, Naomi passed by familiar faces. Matt from the cafe waved at her, holding a tray of coffee cups for his staff. Mrs. Peterson, who had spoken to her at the Unity in Action event months ago, stood with a group of older residents chatting animatedly. Even Mrs. Wilson, who had once been a symbol of quiet disapproval, gave Naomi a curt nod of acknowledgement. Inside the center, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Rows of chairs faced a small stage where a microphone stood waiting. Posters on the walls displayed messages of hope and solidarity, building bridges, strengthen unity, and Millstone together. Naomi took a seat near the back, observing the crowd as they filtered in. Kevin Morales approached her with his signature easy smile. "Nervous?" he asked, handing her a bottled water. "A little," Naomi admitted, unscrewing the cap, "but I've had worse." Kevin chuckled. "True, you've stood up to more than just a room full of people. You'll do great." The event began with opening remarks from the mayor, a middle-aged man with a reputation for cautious optimism. He spoke about the challenges Millstone had faced and the resilience of its residents. His words were met with polite applause, though Naomi sensed that the crowd was waiting for something more personal, something raw. When it was Naomi's turn to speak, she hesitated for a moment at the edge of the stage, her palms damp despite the cool air. But as she stepped up to the microphone, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here to share her truth. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady but warm. "Thank you for being here tonight. It means a lot to me, and I know it means a lot to this community." She paused, scanning the crowd. Faces of all ages and backgrounds looked back at her, some familiar, others new. She took a breath and continued. "When I first joined the Millstone Police Department, I thought my job was simple. Enforce the law, protect the community, and go home at the end of the day. But the past few months have shown me that it's so much more than that. Being a part of this town means being a part of its struggles, its triumphs, and its growth." Her words seemed to resonate. People leaned forward in their seats, their attention focused entirely on her. "The events surrounding Roy Whitman challenged all of us," she said, her tone softening. "They forced us to confront truths about ourselves and our community that weren't easy to face. But they also gave us an opportunity, a chance to come together, to listen, and to learn." She glanced at the banners on the walls, the messages of unity that had become a rallying cry for the town. "We've made progress. I've seen it in the conversations happening at these meetings, in the changes being made in our schools and businesses, and in the way we're starting to look out for one another. But progress isn't the same as perfection. There's still work to do." Her gaze swept the room, landing on a group of teenagers in the back who had been part of a mentoring program inspired by recent events. "We owe it to the next generation to keep moving forward, to show them that even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible, change is worth fighting for." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Naomi barely heard it. She stepped down from the stage, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Kevin clapped her on the shoulder as she returned to her seat. "Told you you'd nail it," he said with a grin. After the event, Naomi lingered in the lobby, talking with residents who approached her. Some shared their own stories of struggle and resilience. Others simply thanked her for her service. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but Naomi accepted it with grace. As the crowd began to thin, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the door. Roy Whitman. He was thinner than she remembered, his posture less rigid, his expression no longer hostile. He held a small notebook in his hands, fidgeting with the corners. Naomi approached him cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "Roy?" she said, her tone neutral. "Officer Jackson," he replied, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I thought maybe I needed to." Naomi studied him for a moment before nodding. "What's on your mind?" Roy hesitated, then held out the notebook. "It's a journal. My anger management counselor suggested I start writing things down. I've been trying to figure out why I became the man I was, and I think I'm starting to understand. I'm not proud of who I've been, but I'm trying to be better." Naomi took the notebook, its worn cover a testament to hours of introspection. She didn't open it, but nodded again. "That's a start." Roy exhaled, relief evident on his face. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I'm working on it. On myself." Naomi's voice softened. "Keep working, Roy. It's the only way forward." He nodded and left without another word, leaving Naomi standing alone in the lobby. She glanced down at the notebook in her hands, feeling the weight of its significance. It wasn't redemption, but it was a step. As Naomi drove home that night, the streets of Millstone felt different. They were the same streets she had patrolled countless times, but they no longer felt heavy with tension. The town wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was changing, growing, becoming something better. Naomi parked her car in front of her house and stepped out, the cool spring air filling her lungs. She looked up at the night sky, stars scattered like seeds across the darkness, and felt a quiet sense of peace. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new conflicts to face, but for tonight, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that she had done her part. Millstone was far from perfect, but it was her home, and for the first time in a long time, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who called it home. As she closed her door and turned off the lights, one thought lingered in her mind. Together, we can stand against anything. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories, and don't forget to click the bell. Share this video with your friends if you liked it, and write in the comments what you think about this story. Your support helps us create more great videos.